Hi, welcome to this presentation on logical arguments for the existence of God. In this presentation, we are going to talk about that logic provides tools to analyze arguments for the God's existence. For example, the basic law of logic, which is a law of non-contradiction, says A cannot be A and not A at the same time. In other words, God exists or he doesn't exist. Both cannot be true at the same time. So, in this presentation, we are going to look at some of the traditional arguments for the existence of God. Most of these arguments are the deductive arguments. Now, if you do not know what is deductive and inductive arguments, so the deductive arguments has two premises, and basically if those two premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. Now, the inductive is one in which the premises are intended to make the conclusion probable, not certain. And all these arguments that we are going to see in this presentation, they are type of syllogism. A syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning in which a conclusion is logically derived from two premises. So as we discussed, the deductive reasoning has two premises and a conclusion. So a syllogism is logically derived from two premises. It's a deductive type of reasoning. It has a major premise and a minor premise and a conclusion. So, a major premise is mostly a general statement or universal truth. A minor premise is a specific statement related to the major premise, and then a conclusion. For example, all men are mortal. So, that is a major premise in a syllogism. And then a minor premise would be Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. In this presentation, we are going to look at some of these traditional arguments for the existence of God. These arguments are the cosmological arguments. We are going to look at both horizontal and the vertical form of the cosmological argument. Then we are going to look at the teleological argument, moral argument, ontological argument, and also fine-tuning argument. Thomas Aquinas, he has his famous 5 ways for the existence of God. We are not going to look at those arguments given by Thomas Aquinas, but I'm just going to briefly mention about these arguments. You can find these arguments in his writing Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3. These arguments are not emotional appeals but rational, philosophical proofs grounded in observation of the natural world. So, these 5 ways of Aquinas are argument from motion, argument from efficient causality, argument from necessary being, argument from the degree of perfection, and argument from final causality. So let's begin with our first argument, the traditional argument, which is the cosmological argument. And this is particularly a horizontal form of cosmological argument. This horizontal argument argues in a linear fashion back to the beginning, also known as the Kalam cosmological argument. This was formulated by Arab philosopher of Middle Ages, and later in our time we see Dr. William Lane Craig. He widely published on this argument. So the argument goes, and like we discussed, this is a deductive type of argument. So it has two premises and a conclusion. So this is basically called as a syllogism. It's a deductive type of reasoning. First premises goes this way: whatever that begins to exist has a cause. Now we have to pay attention to this first premise because many times people misunderstand this Kalam cosmological argument, and it says whatever that begins to exist, not that whatever that exists has a cause, but whatever that begins to exist has a cause. The second premise goes this way, that the universe began to exist, and therefore the conclusion is that therefore the universe has a cause beyond itself. So here we can see the principle of causality, that every finite thing is caused by something other than itself. Now, atheists normally offer a counter argument to this cosmological argument for the existence of God, and they would say that God is a self-caused being, but it is impossible to cause one's own being, for a cause is prior to its effect, and one can't be prior to oneself. and therefore God cannot exist. Now, there are problems with this argument. This is called a straw man fallacy in the first premise, where they say that God is a self-caused being. Atheists do not hold that God is a self-caused being. This is a contradictory concept. Rather, theists define God as uncaused being, which is not contradictory. Now, let's look at some of the evidences for the Kalam cosmological argument. There are scientific evidence and a philosophical evidence. Scientific evidence, for example, law of thermodynamics. So, the amount of usable energy is decreasing according to the law of thermodynamics. So, according to the second law of thermodynamics, in a closed, isolated system, such as the universe is, the amount of usable energy is decreasing. The universe is running down, and hence it cannot be eternal. So things left to themselves without outside intervention tend towards disorder. That is called entropy. Since the universe has not reached a state of total disorder, this process has not been going on forever. And therefore, we can say that the universe had a beginning based on the law of thermodynamics. Now, there is also among the scientists one of the widely accepted theory for the origin of the universe is a Big Bang cosmology. So according to the Big Bang cosmology, the universe exploded some 15 to 20 billion years ago, and evidence offered for this include the redshift or Doppler effect is noticed in the light from stars as they move away. The radiation echo from space, which has the same wavelength that gigantic cosmic explosion would give off. Discovery of the mass of energy, such as was expected from an explosion. The general theory of relativity. So these are some of the evidences offered for the Big Bang theory. So Big Bang is one of the widely accepted theory for the beginning of the universe. Now, there are some philosophical evidences. For example, time must have had a beginning, and there is a logical argument for that as well. So, an infinite number of moments cannot be transverse. An infinite number of moments had to elapse before today, and then today would never had come. But today has come. So, therefore, an infinite number of moments have not elapsed before today. Therefore, universe had a beginning. But whatever has beginning is caused by something else. Hence, there must be a cause, a creator of the universe. A famous agnostic, Robert Jastrow, he was the founder director of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. He said that a sound explanation may exist for the explosive birth of our universe. But if it does, science cannot find out what the explanation is. The scientist's pursuit of the past end in the moment of creation. So, in other words, if the universe was created, then it is reasonable to conclude there was a creator. For everything that has a beginning needs a beginner. Now, let's look at the vertical form of this cosmological argument. The horizontal Kalam cosmological argument that we just saw, that the universe begin to exist and therefore it must have a cause, and we as a theist would say that that cause is God. Now, that horizontal form of Kalam cosmological argument argues only that there was once a creator at the beginning of the universe. It doesn't show the continuous need of the creator. The most famous proponent of the vertical argument was Thomas Aquinas. This argument goes this way. The first premise is that every part of the universe is dependent. If every part is dependent, then the whole universe must also be dependent. Therefore, the whole universe is dependent for existence right now on some independent being. This argument not only says that there was once a creator in the beginning, but this creator is sustaining the universe. For example, if we look at this argument from the Bible, Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And that we can associate with the horizontal form of the cosmological argument. But the vertical form of the cosmological argument, for example, Colossians 1:17, that says, He is before all things. It's talking about Jesus, and in him all things hold together. So basically, he is not only the beginner of the universe or the creator of the universe, but he's also sustainer. God is also the sustainer who is sustaining the universe at this point of time. So this is the vertical form of cosmological argument. Now, let's look at the teleological argument. Now, there are many forms of the design argument. The most famous one is William Paley's watchmaker analogy. Whatever we see in a complex design, we know from our previous experiences that it came from a mind of the designer. For example, if we look at the painting, there is a painter behind it. If we see a book, there is a writer behind it. If we look at the watch, there is a watchmaker behind it. If there is a building, there is an architect behind it. If you see a computer code, there is someone who has coded that code, a coder behind it. The teleological argument goes this way. The first premise is that all complex design implies a designer. There is a complex design in the universe, and therefore there must be a designer of the universe. So the universe shows order, complexity, and fine tuning. So even the biochemistry has unveiled a complex design in our cell. This complex design manifests in two ways. One is the irreducible complexity. For example, our eyes. All the parts of the eye must be there at the same time for you to see. Like, for example, in a watch, all parts of the watch needs to be there, the inner mechanism, in an order for watch to function properly. And the second type is the specified complexity. For example, our DNA code that has adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. So that is called a specified complexity. So there is an irreducible complexity and a specified complexity. Now, the living cell has both specificity and complexity, and this type of complexity can not be produced just by the natural laws. It cannot be just random or by chance. It is always the result of an intelligent being. There are people who gives arguments against the teleology, and they would say that the universe was either designed or else it happened by chance. But the chance is an adequate cause of the universe. Therefore, the universe was not designed. And there are logical problems with this type of an argument, especially the second premise where they say the chance is an adequate cause of the universe. Evidence is much stronger that the universe had a beginning and it's not just by chance. As we already seen in our cosmological argument, the Big Bang theory or the law of thermodynamics that says that the universe had a beginning. So it was not just by chance that was the cause of an adequate cause of the universe. So the conclusion we can come is that intelligent designer best explains such an order and specified complexity and irreducible complexity that we see in our cell, in our DNA, or any complex design in the universe. Now, let's look at the fine-tuning argument. The premises goes that the physical constant and initial condition of the universe are fine-tuned for the existence of life. The very fact that we can see life on planet Earth because the initial condition and the physical constant of the universe are fine-tuned for the existence of life, and we are going to look at some of this constant such as a gravitational constant, cosmological constant, strong nuclear force, the ratio of electrons to protons, etc. So fine-tuning is either due to physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not, the third premise goes, it is not due to the physical necessity or chance. Therefore, the conclusion is that the fine-tuning is best explained by an intelligent designer. In theistic world, we would say that it is God who has designed the universe. If we look at any radio and we have to exactly finely tune the radio in order for us to listen to any channel clearly, just like how we fine tune our radio for the right frequency. So that is how the designer of the universe has fine tuned the initial condition of the universe so that the life is possible. Fine tuning means that many constant and quantities of nature fall within a very narrow range that makes life possible. A slight change, sometimes as small as 1 part in 10 raised to 40, would make the universe lifeless. For example, as we have discussed, gravitational constant. So, if gravity were even slightly stronger, all stars would collapse into black holes. If it were slightly weaker, stars would never form and therefore no planets or life could exist. Cosmological constant, for an example, this constant determines the rate at which the universe expands. If it differed by even 1 part in 10 raised to 120, the universe would have expanded too fast or too slow for galaxies and stars to form. Physicist Stephen Hawking called this the most remarkable fine tuning in all of the physics, and he is an atheist. The ratio of strong nuclear force, this force holds atoms together. If it were slightly stronger, hydrogen, the building block of water, would be unstable. If it is slightly weaker, no atoms heavier than hydrogen would exist, no carbon, no oxygen, and therefore no life. So, this was the fine tuning argument. Now, the next one is the moral argument. So, the argument goes that the moral law implies a moral lawgiver. There is an objective moral law, and therefore there is a moral lawgiver. The biblical basis for this argument is Romans 2, verses 12 to 15. Romans 2 says, "For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are the law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts." So, this is the most important phrase, that the Gentiles show the work of the law written in their hearts. So, what they do is the work of the law, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts cursing or else excursing them. So, the law written on their heart, no one is without any excuse. The first premise, that the moral law implies a moral lawgiver, that is self-evident. Moral law doesn't describe what is, they prescribe what ought to be. They can't be known like a natural law by observing what people do. They are what all persons should do. The weight of this argument lies on the second premise, where it says there is an objective moral law. There is an objective moral law. This law is not prescribed by us, but for us. For example, how do we know that Hitler was wrong? There has to be a moral law beyond all of us by which we are all bound. But if there is such universal, objective moral law, then there must be a universal moral lawgiver, and we call him as God. Another example we can give is, in our judgment, we think that the world is getting better or worse. But how do we know this unless there are standards beyond the world by which we could measure it? So, this was the moral law argument. Basically, says that if there is an objective moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver, and we call him God. Now, let's look at the next argument, which is an ontological argument. The first philosopher known to have developed the ontological argument was Anselm in the Middle Ages. The simple explanation could be God is the greatest conceivable being. If he existed only in the mind, he wouldn't be greatest. Therefore, he must exist in reality. Now, there are two forms of this argument, one from the idea of perfect being and the another from the idea of necessity being. So, the perfect being argument goes this way, that God is by definition an absolutely perfect being, but existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist. Now, the second form of the argument is the necessary being. If God exists, we must conceive of him as a necessary being. The second premise is that, but by definition, a necessary being cannot not exist. Therefore, if a necessary being can, then it must exist. So the argument from the perfect being, if God did not exist, then he would be lacking one perfection, namely the existence. But if God lacked any perfection, then he would not be absolutely perfect. But God is by definition an absolutely perfect being. Therefore, an absolutely perfect being must exist. Since the time of Kant, this argument is invalid because existence is not a perfection. For example, a dollar in your mind has the same property as the one in your pocket. Whereas the necessary being argument that we saw just now is not subject to this criticism. In summary, the ontological argument cannot prove the existence of God, but it can prove certain things about his nature. For example, God must necessarily exist if he exists at all. He cannot cease to exist or exist contingently. Now, let's look at the conclusion. So, after looking all these arguments, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument, so what is the conclusion? So, no single proof is absolute. The multiple arguments together form a strong rational case for a personal, intelligent, moral creator. Logic and reason point towards God's existence. Faith and reasons are complementary, not opposed. So sometimes people think that only faith is necessary. Reason and logic are not necessary. But faith and reason, they are complementary to each other and they are not opposed. Socratic method of logic encourages dialogue and not dogmatism. Apart from this logical argument, we can say that the argument from the religious experience is also one of the arguments that can be given for the existence of God. Millions of people throughout the world testify to the personal encounter with God. So the argument from the religious experience that can also be added to this argument about the existence of God. Now, there are some objections, such as the atheist may raise the objection that science explains the universe. The response could be that science explains how and not why. Some people would say that maybe it's a chance. The response is that chance cannot explain the fine tuning or the moral order that we just saw in these arguments, in the fine tuning argument or the moral law argument. There could be a third objection that says we can't prove God. The response to that argument would be that many truths like love, morality, logic are known by reason and not by the lab test. So the conclusion is that the universe had a cause and that is pointing towards God. Life shows the design and that points towards God. Morality implies a lawgiver and that also points towards God. And reason and experiences point to God. So all this logical argument point towards a personal, intelligent, moral creator. We saw in this presentation a cosmological, both the horizontal and the vertical form of the argument. Then we saw the teleological argument, we saw the fine-tuning argument, moral argument, ontological argument, and all these arguments point towards the intelligent, personal, moral creator in the theistic world we call God, and all these arguments point towards God. So I hope this presentation has helped you understanding the important arguments about the existence of God and how we can use the logic and reason to point towards the existence of God. Thank you and God bless.